Hello, I'm Jen Maxey, Director of Programs here at the Skirball Cultural Center. In early December 2021, we were honored to co-present with Writers Bloc a very special program with poet Amanda Gorman that celebrated her first full volume of poetry, Call Us What We Carry. What follows in this video are excerpts from that program where Amanda sat down with one of her mentors, Dr. Elizabeth Alexander, another inaugural poet, to talk about the book and her process. I'd like to thank Engaging the Senses Foundation for their support of this and all of our poetry programming at the Skirball. We are very grateful for their support. We hope you enjoy this short excerpt from this very special conversation between two extraordinary women.
Well, we have a lot to talk about, and I want to just dive right in, first of all, by kind of caressing, holding, feeling the heft, really just praising this beautiful baby that you have made. It's extraordinary. And just to start, I mean, we knew that in this incredible year, you were finishing the book. And when, we would communicate, you'd tell me you were working hard. And I thought, a slim volume. But what you've done is it is a major, major undertaking. I mean, for a book of poems, I would call it sort of an epic book of poems that's trying to do something, not only one thing very large, but many significant things within it.
Yeah.
So could you talk about the making of this book?
Absolutely. You're very spot on that when I first started this collection, in let's say the spring of 2021, I thought it was going to be maybe 60, 70 poems or pages. That's what I expected, that's what I planned. And as I kept writing, I felt that since I wanted to, in my own kind of phraseology, create a time capsule of what it means emotionally to go through a pandemic, that's something that's really massive. It's something that feels very weighty, very heavy. And I wanted a book that also mirrored that same type of sensation. And so that meant thinking really big and in kind of epic nature about poetry. And the interesting thing about that is, honestly, this book could have been twice as long. There's so much that was cut, so much that was slimmed down, because I still wanted to make sure I kept what needed to be said and what made kind of the most impact on the page. And that when the smoke cleared and the rubble kind of moved out the way, I saw I had this book, which was, I think, much more than what I had even dreamed it could be a few months prior.
I'm wondering about facing pain and grief. It's very harrowing. It's very brave. And one of the things that I've heard a lot of people talk about when they think back to the early months of COVID-19 is that they've almost blanked out how afraid we were when we didn't know, when we had to stay apart from each other.
Yeah.
Can you talk about, just the sort of diving into the wreck, to quote Adrienne Rich?
Yeah, I love that quote. Diving into the wreck was really hard because I think a lot of the most kind of profound and like systematic revision that I did on the work in creation in itself occurred at a moment in the pandemic where I think a lot of people didn't want to talk about the grief. It was kind of in the pre-summer area where we were getting these signals of, if you're vaccinated, you don't have to wear a mask, and et cetera, and et cetera. And I just remember talking with people and them being so exhausted by the loss, so kind of fatigued by the grief, that they really just wanted to focus on this moment of feeling liberated, feeling kind of rejuvenated at last. And I think there's a space and definitely a type of allowance that we can give ourselves to those types of joys. But having to be in that moment and then go back to my desk and kind of walk among, well, let's talk about our ghosts. Let's talk about what we went through. Let's talk about our grief and our scars. That was a really hard thing because I was one of those people who was like, yeah, I would have loved to kind of give myself amnesia and like not remember these past 100 or so days, but I'm going to write something down that can encapsulate both that joy and both that haunting. It means giving space for them both. It means letting all of that type of humanity speak to me. So it was hard and challenging. But I kept telling myself, and this is, I think, kind of a line that is in the book towards kind of the latter half of it, that I think sometimes only by diving into the deepest, darkest waters within us do we rise above it. And I really tried to do that with poetry.
Mhm. I'm wondering also kind of what your days were like if we start off the year with this, catapulting onto a world stage and all of the things that came your way because of that extraordinary day. And you're writing a book and you can move around and then you can't move around. What were you able to have some ritual in your days? How did you move through?
It was me waking up, maybe eating, and then spending the rest of the day kind of suffused in this fever dream where I would just be so caught up in what I was creating and writing. It was almost like I think of it as almost like a dolphin or a whale or something like that. There's a lot of
Mhm.
sea imagery in this book, by the way, where they kind of go underwater and they can hold their breath for long amounts of time and come up for air.
Mm.
And I felt like that was kind of what I was doing every single day. It was kind of really taking that dive, and noon to like 3 p.m. would be that moment where I was like in it, in the waves, in the water. And then towards the end of the day, I'd have to let myself come back up for oxygen because I need that. I think we all do. So that was kind of the cyclical nature of it. And I'm glad to be on the other side of it because it was difficult. But those were kind of what my days looked like when I could have that type of stability.
Mhm, mhm. That's an incredible image to think about, holding your breath for a long time underwater. And I know I saw in the notes that you thanked people for reminding you to eat, and I know that was always my impulse. There are our familiar forms and there are invented forms. So for our audience, Amanda has made a hangman poem form. She's made a text poem, which the text poem form is fascinating.
Thank
It
you.
actually really moves nicely. Then there are shaped poems, which have a very long history, as you know, in the English tradition, back to poets like, George Herbert and, all kinds of others. Then there are poems that are, I think, playing with some Black arts movement shapes. And I wanted to ask you first about how you thought about moving in all those forms, and also particularly about the erasure poems, if you could tell us about that.
I love that you brought up the erasure poems. Also, I just want to take a moment in time to recognize that Elizabeth Alexander said she likes the way I play with shape. That means so much to me. Oh my God, sorry. Just
It's the
snapshotting that
truth.
in my head for my, scrapbook that I make of moments. But to answer your great question, I, wanted writing this book, one, to be a real challenge and playground for myself, I wanted it to be this homegoing because personally for me, I love spoken word, and I think so much of my poetry is animated by that. But I began as a written word poet because I had a speech impediment. And so I typically depended on all of those kind of instruments that you can use on the page to communicate. And I really wanted to celebrate that and have that be something that I could come back to in the book. And I also thought that by playing with shape, playing with erasure, playing with text messages and hangman and other types of formats, it would create all of these different opportunities by which we could look at our own situation anew. That when something felt so massive and so close and kind of so enormous to be looked at with any precision, by looking at it in 100 myriad of ways, at least one of those hopefully would trigger that moment, which would give some type of aha, or now I see moment, not only to the reader, but also to myself. And so I wanted to be a bit more audacious with my poem because I think our situation demanded that.
I first met Amanda when she was in high school. It was before you were getting ready, because we wrote afterwards and you were like, I'm going to Harvard. So I think, I think it was maybe at a White House youth poetry event.
Yep.
And so, and then after that, we read together at that event where our queen, Sonia Sanchez, was reading. And I'm mentioning these events to say that you've always had a remarkable sense of style, decoration, occasion, and which to me feels like Black women forever and all time. It feels like my grandmother and her friends, like just ready, dressed in their own style for any occasion, and also ready even if the world wasn't ready for them.
Yeah, right.
That they were all put together. So that's how I see you. So I would love to know about self-presentation and how you've thought about that over time, maybe even as a child.
I love that. Also just trying to process, remembering when we first met. That's a journey. I think for me, and I love that you brought up, your grandmother and the Black woman that from a young age, because of, I think, the Black community that I was raised in, I saw fashion not just as expression, but as weaponry. My grandmother was telling me what it meant to show up in your Sunday best at civil rights marches, that it wasn't just about looking nice or looking pretty. It was about demanding humanity by
That's right.
communicating that humanity through your body, through your hair, through your makeup, with how that might show up for you. And that is something that I think I took up as a real mantle as I became a young woman and as I became a poet. I think there's this stereotype of the poet wearing like grungy boots and like a beret hat and like a reading with like a hand-me-down scarf on at a cafe. And I love that poet. That poet seems very cozy and comfortable. I love that outfit. I think we're so much more than that. And it's not just, the words that we're saying, but how we're saying it and how we're, visualizing ourselves in that space. So I love to do a good throwdown with my looks and show up exactly.
There you go.
As I will read the first poem in the collection.
Great.
Which is called Ship's Manifest.
Oh, great. I'm glad you chose that one.
Yeah, thanks. This one I really wrote to try to visualize for myself a thesis for the book that I could kind of follow and map the rest of the poems on top of. Ship's Manifest. Allegedly, the worst is behind us. Still, we crouch before the lip of tomorrow, halting like a headless hand in our own house, waiting to remember exactly what it is we're supposed to be doing. And what exactly are we supposed to be doing? Penning a letter to the world as a daughter of it. We are writing with vanishing meaning, our words water dragging down a windshield. The poet's diagnosis is that what we have lived has already warped itself into a fever dream, the contours of its shape stripped from the murky mind. To be accountable, we must render unaccount, not what was said, but what was meant, not the fact, but what was felt, what was known even while unnamed. Our greatest test will be our testimony. This book is a message in a bottle. This book is a letter. This book does not let up. This book is awake. This book is awake. For what is a record but a reckoning? The capsule captured, a repository, an arc articulated, in the poet, the preserver, a ghost in gains, our demons in dreams, our haunts in hopes. Here's to the preservation of a light so terrible.
Beautiful. Oh my goodness. Thank you. Thank you for that. I do think that poets make extremely fine prose writers because of the concision, because of the attention to music, because of the sense of what is essential, because of poetic impatience. With, there's just not a lot of connective tissue. You're just trying to get to where you're going. You're moving. Yeah. Poems have velocity, which I think is a real gift to prose.
I think musicality, rhythm, all of that were things that I was very conscious of because I think they make up the lifeblood of who I am as a poet. of the ways, for example, that I would work on my kind of speech pathology to overcome my speech impediment was to read poetry, was to listen to rap and try to kind of read with the cadence of those poets and like spoken word orators. And so it was a lot of that, and also just cards of alliteration. So read, rode, wore. And I began to see kind of units of sound, not necessarily as something that was crippling, but a great kind of communicative strength. And I think that's where my love of alliteration, of rhyme, comes from, because that was a huge healing tool for me as I was kind of navigating what it meant to have a disability. I think the message in a bottle that I try to send in this book and just throughout the body of my work is hope, and not a kind of flat, unsubstantiated hope that comes from, I think, kind of ignorant optimism. It's a type of hope that comes from an understanding of hardship, of history, of an honest look at where we are, what we've been, and what we can become. Because I think that type of hope is all the more sustainable, all the more strong. And what's more, it actually gets us to where we want to go.